Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and given the fact that this is another Fine Points, obviously that means that we're going to be speaking today with Bruce Fein again. And Bruce, I think the topic of conversation today is this was a pretty busy week. It was a week a lot of people were pardoned from both the Trump side and the Biden side, and a bunch of executive orders have been issued. Some has already reached a court where the court has opined on the presentation of a specific executive order with respect to birthright citizenship. So let's just jump right in and focus on the ones you want to, first tackle. So go ahead, Bruce.
Okay, well, let's first focus on the pardons because I think it's shown it's really deteriorated in this complete misuse that ought to provoke Congress to impeach then remove them from office. When the framers were debating entrusting the pardon power to the president, they discussed what would happen if a president used the pardon power to shelter his personal or political friends. And they said, well, surely that's an impeachable offense. We had to get rid of that president immediately. We now know, however, that impeachment is a scarecrow because the polarization of the parties, you'll never get the 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict, even if you can get a simple majority in the House. And so let's just examine the abuses of the impeachment power just in the last weeks of the Biden administration, the first day of Mr. Trump. So let's start with President Biden. He pardons, after he said he would never interfere and pardon his son, Hunter Biden, then he changes his mind and says, I'm going to issue a pardon to my son, despite the conflict of interest. And he says, of all things, Jeffrey, it's because there was such unfair treatment under my administration. You were politically witch hunted. Really? So, I mean, that's really incredible.
Bruce, you have to appreciate one statement was made by candidate Biden, and don't confuse candidate Biden with President Biden.
Yeah.
So President Biden did not make that statement. Candidate Biden made that statement.
Right. Yeah.
So President Biden is not bound by the statement made by candidate Biden.
Yeah. Those are, yeah. He had his fingers crossed behind his back. You don't really believe me, do you? But then he went on, Jeffrey, and did one of the most, perhaps the unprecedented in the history of pardons. It's over 200 years. And he issued pardons to his family. He issued pardons to all the members of the January 6th committee that investigated the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. He pardoned a couple of witnesses who testified before the committee. And he says, you're not investigated for crime. You haven't committed any crimes, but I'm going to anticipate you'll be the subject of a witch hunt by Mr. Trump, and therefore I'm issuing you a pardon. I think these are flagrantly unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has said that you have to accept a pardon for it to be legitimate, and there has to be at least some suspicion that there's criminality here. We have a host of procedural safeguards against the government manipulating law enforcement to perpetrate witch hunts, so to speak. And there were several who said, we don't want and we're not going to accept the pardon. Adam Schiff and Adam Kinzinger both said, this is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong. I'll just use my rights. So this was, I think, a totally wrongful use of the pardon power. Moreover, Mr. Trump said immediately after that pardon of Mr. Biden, I'm going to use that on my last day when I leave in 2029, indicating that it's going to create a cycle of uses of pardons really to frustrate law enforcement because there's no limit to issuing pardons to someone who's not been accused of a crime and is not under investigation of crime. They could issue it to you or me, Jeffrey, or anybody watching. I mean, it's going to be like a photo op, your monopoly money. You put it on your door or your office. Those are very, very troubling. And then we have Trump's pardons, which are equally troubling.
Let me go back to the Biden pardon first before we talk about Trump. Is there any authority that can void any of these pardons?
The difficulty we have, the only way you can void them really is through impeaching the president. And Biden's gone. You could still impeach him. They impeached Mr. Trump after he left based upon his January 6th activities. But that's not going to happen.
But
The problem,
would impeach Biden void the pardons?
you could, I believe that they could say that that's voids the pardon. The issue that we have here, Jeffrey, is who has standing. Who's been injured by the pardon. And so it's not really fit for a court trial, if you so to speak. Now, maybe if they do something that they wouldn't have been able to do without the pardon, 10 years from now, you could say, well, there's kind of a proximate cause relationship between the pardon and this wrongdoing, and then I'm going to sue President Biden. It's going to be very difficult to put that into a context that would permit an adjudication. I do think that a court would accept impeachment and conviction as a legal adjudication, that there is no effective pardon here. Now, in some sense, it also becomes very difficult to have a legal analysis in the traditional context, because what's the harm? They didn't commit a crime. They weren't an investigated crime. They don't have a crime. And as regards things prospectively, and this is where the pardons really become much, in my view, paper tigers, because Trump could just concoct something new. Remember, pardons only affect actions that have happened before the pardon.
Prior to the date of the pardon.
So after January 20th, they can say money laundering, tax evasion, anything they could drum up and said, no, we'll prosecute you for that. So it doesn't eliminate the partisan use of law enforcement to go after the enemies anyway. So why even do that? Why cast a cloud and make it look like you're manipulating the system instead of enforcing the system? So I think it's a very bad precedent.
Can Congress rein in the scope of how pardons are used, or they really don't have any say?
They don't. No, the Supreme Court has addressed that and says no. I think they can do this. They could say you can't issue a pardon and make it criminal to accept a bribe in exchange for a pardon. I think that is constitutional, but that's not the issue that we're confronting at present.
So ultimately, what we have is there really is the only possible remedy for an abuse of pardon power is impeachment, but that might or might not nullify or void the pardon, because I don't think there's no precedent yet on that issue. So we don't know whether the president would be impeached, but the pardons would stay, or the president would be impeached because of issuing illegal pardons, and that would also void the pardon. There's really no precedent on that. So we don't really know what the outcome would that be, but this is just an extraordinary power that's been granted to the constitutional power that's been granted by the president. The courts have been kind of flexible in giving that discretion to the president, and it's kind of a discretion that has really almost no accountability, or maybe no accountability to it. That basically at the sole discretion, of the president, how they're going to apply it. Now, the one argument I would make, and again, I'm not going to defend, preemptive pardons, but the context of these preemptive pardons, are kind of understandable in one context. Again, I don't want to justify them because I think they're wrong, but I do want to just provide, a devil's advocate argument. That doesn't mean I think that they were appropriate, but the context is unusual context. We have a president that said he was going to do retribution, and the person he put in charge of the FBI, to run these investigations, wrote a book saying, that they're going to target all these people. So they've announced in advance, an intention to investigate all these people. And so, there's a threat of political persecution against these people, and to prevent them from political persecution, a pardon was issued. So, I mean, you have to always look at things in the context of which they occurred. And again, that doesn't mean I believe that preemptive pardons, should be issued. I'm against the issue of preemptive pardons, but I can also understand the context of, why they were issued and who they were issued to in some respect. I mean, throughout they've only referred to the Biden crime family, the Biden crime family, the Biden crime family. That's been a big theme about putting the Biden crime family in prison. and they've made arguments about everybody who served on the January 6th commission. So there's some prior context to the issuing, of these pardons, and I believe probably a lot of thought was given to it. Again, I don't want to say that I was in agreement with the decision, but I don't want to say I don't have any understanding for the decision.
Yeah,
relevant.
Those points are valid, but let me try to add context to this. The additional context is, one, Trump thought about the same kind of anticipatory pardons before he left, and his advisors said no. And his advisors said that he could do anything under the sun except turn straw into gold. The second thing, Jeffrey, is that where you have such open and notorious motivations, say you have an FBI director, he lists the people, William Barr and others, Pat Cipollone, who were lawyers for Trump. It is a defense in a prosecution to show that the motivation was invidious. Here, what the motivation is, because these people tried to discharge their duties under the law, that clearly would qualify as an invidious motivation. Now, that would be a defense in a court of law. Now, it's obviously true. You can go through a lot of hassle before you can get a case dismissed. You can have, a cloud of uncertainty over your head. All sorts of things could drain your pocketbook in trying to defend yourself. Those are inherent in the system of prosecutorial discretion. But I believe that you have to apply the doctrine of occasionally the cure is worse than the disease. You've identified a disease, but the cure is worse, because then you're authorizing any president to do anything to pardon all of his friends forever without limit. And it's going to continue in a cycle. At this stage, we have to trust the judicial system to put up the blockade to prevent the president from using law enforcement as a witch hunt. Is it going to be perfect? No.
The judicial system that basically said that that Trump is above the law, is that the system that people are supposed to trust? I mean, this unfortunately is the problem. The problem is that we've lost complete faith, in all the institutions, and there's a good reason for having lost, because of how politicized everything is. So, and again, I agree with you. The cure is worse than the disease, but just because they created a bad cure doesn't mean we should ignore the disease. Okay.
No, I agree with that too.
So my point is, I don't like the cure, nor do I like the disease. So we don't like the people who don't like the Biden's cure. Also, don't want to attack the disease.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think that we're looking at a smaller problem and a much bigger problem context that we have, which is the absence of any checks on executive power. The judicial branch can't be trusted. Congress can't be trusted. So it's just, we hope that we don't get a Julius Caesar or an Adolf Hitler, in the White House. And that's not a very reassuring safeguard. Other than that, the safeguard is you and me and the public citizens writing in, protesting, electing different people to office, having town meetings and say this is not acceptable. If we don't stand up, it's not going to happen for sure. The cravenness in Congress has reached all-time high. And the judicial branch, as you point out, Trump versus United States, basically did a coronation for the president, like Napoleon's self-coronation, but he didn't have judges do it. He at least did it himself. And that's a real danger that we have. But let me move on to the Trump pardons, which were all the January 6th defendants. There were over 1,600. He included, although he was saying that he was all in favor of the police, he included pardons for those who attacked the police. There were 3 who died. There were 140 injuries. And they're back. And as soon as they released 2 of the most notorious, these are Proud Boys and Oath Keepers. I call them the equivalent of the SA and the SS and the Gestapo in the Third Reich. They immediately said, well, now we're going to retaliate against our enemies being those who wanted to enforce the law. So that's really dangerous. And of course, it's not just you or me, Jeffrey. This is the International Association of Chiefs of Police protested. the fraternal orders of police protest and say, how can you ask us to put our lives on the line? And then you're going to give pardons to those who tried and in some sense did kill us. So it's an odd showing of how what I believe Trump is so completely unprincipled when it comes to executing the powers of his office.
I think my opinion on this, and then it's just speculation on my part, is that Trump's and I think there's evidence to this effect, is that Trump wants to change the entire narrative of how January 6th is recorded in history. So if you're going to change the narrative that it was a day of peace and love and these people were heroes and they are ending up as hostages, and if you want to continue to advance that narrative, and he has 4 years to do that, to accomplish, basically erasing the past and replacing it with a new narrative, and that new narrative becomes the narrative that becomes embedded and imprinted in people's histories books, so that people will forget the prior narrative, and the only narrative they will know about is the Trump narrative. And so if you want to rewrite the narrative completely, then you have to basically pardon everyone. So because you have to basically say nothing bad happened here, these were the good guys. So so there were no bad actors there. The bad actors were the other team. So I think this is part of a strategy. Again, this is just my personal opinion, but I think it's part of a strategy to rewrite history and to control the narrative. And if you want to control the narrative, a natural consequence or byproduct of controlling the narrative is nobody on his side did anything wrong. So so I think that I think that's what the effort is about.
But it may come back to boomerang, Jeffrey. These guys, I mean, certainly Oath Keepers and Proud Boys are likely to commit new crimes. I mean, they're the SS and the SA. So these people's they live off of criminality. They live off of intimidation. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any followers. So maybe Trump is going to have to pardon them again. But then that's going to be a very difficult narrative to pardon them again, because they would then be accused of serious crimes. Well, he's been in the presidency. So I believe it's going to create more difficulty down the road for him politically. And all of the police associations totally and completely denounced what he did. And that narrative is going to resonate at least with the people who serve in the police forces.
More than I don't think the police force will sustain that, because he's looking to expand the qualified immunity the police department has. He pardoned, I guess, a couple of a police officer or two police officers that were involved in through an action. Some citizen died. I forget what the circumstances were. So he threw them a bone. So to the extent that some might be unhappy about this, he's rewarding them in another respect, and that maybe that will quiet them down, that they're not happy about this, but to the extent that he will work to broaden the scope of qualified immunity for police, that'll be worth more to them than how much they'll remember about that he pardoned
No, you may be right. It's a political calculation, but just for our audience, the police already have qualified immunity that's almost insurmountable, because if you're denied it, you have an immediate right of appeal, which means no one can sue the police and expect to get a decision. For years, I've been involved in that, Jeffrey. You get, as soon as you win, you discredit qualified immunity at the district court level, U.S. Supreme Court, because you go right up to the Court of Appeals. You're waiting a year and a half. Your plaintiffs are not Elon Musk. They don't have staying power, and the thing goes away. I don't know how much more immunity they can get than what they already have, but they may view that as at least some kind of sympathy in any event. So it may turn out that politically he's able to turn this around. I think it's really very regrettable, if not alarming, that we're even having this conversation, Jeffrey. We're talking about how people who violate the law, are able to evade it. We should be talking about how we want to enforce the law, make sure it's even-handed. And so we have a law-abiding society. rather than going back to the law of the jungle, or pretty soon it's going to be the Kalashnikov culture of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this is ridiculous. There were weapons used on January 6th, and basically saying there was nothing wrong with that. You can imagine the next time there's a January 6th, everyone will say, hey, it doesn't matter. We'll be the burning of the Reichstag. We'll all get pardons anyway. We know what happened before. We don't have any deterrent effect. Really, we're going in that direction right now.
Yeah, the founders told us, they warned us. The fact is that an exercise in self-government requires a well-educated, well-informed, virtuous public, and that therefore, if they were well-educated, well-informed, knowledgeable, and virtuous, they would pick people to occupy office in Washington, D.C. that would reflect those values. Obviously, we don't choose virtuous people. So, you get up there and you see this exit. And, I think to some extent, there's probably a lot of hypocrisy because, whatever alcohol problems he has, there are probably many other people in the Senate and Congress who probably also have drink to excess.
Jeffrey, let me just interject here. A historical moment
where they make payouts. Yes, Bruce.
Jeffrey, John Tower had the same drinking problem of Hegseth, and he was in the Senate and he was voted down. I was there. That was 50 years ago.
Yeah,
when he was nominated. It shows you how debased the culture has become. John Tower could get voted down for something that Hegseth does, and the Republicans shrug their shoulders. That doesn't matter to me, Anyway, go ahead.
True.
I apologize for the interruption.
No, but I guess, and we have a Congress that has a slush fund for paying out on accusations of harassments, and there's no transparency about who committed the harassment that the government needed to pay out. So I mean, there's hypocrisy in this process. But yeah, at least maybe the optics were, while maybe there were a whole bunch of people, with drinking issues, that if it became public, that at least they felt some sense of shame, and that they were, and then they said, society says, this information is now public. And given the fact that it's now public, we need to do the right thing. We wouldn't do the right thing if it wasn't public. But now that it is public, we got to do the right thing. And back then, once it became public, you're right. The standard de mores at that is that people would say, well, we might all be all drinking as much as Tower is, but the point is nobody knows that, and people know about Tower doing it. So it's a bad look, and it dishonors the office that we have somebody who behaves this way, and we put him in a position like that, him or her in a position like that. So at least 50 years ago, people would say, this looks bad, and we can't dishonor the office by having somebody that now the public knows behaves like this to occupy that position. And now you don't care. We don't care about the fact that he's probably, he's had accusations of abusing his wives, and drinking problems, and he gets up and says, well, a lot of the stuff I didn't do and the bad things I did is all in the past, and I'm a new person today. And everybody shakes their head and says, okay, great, let's move forward. So
just to add on what you've just commented, it's maybe a little bit of a side. Today there's the headline story in the Washington Post about how the a House committee that was so-called investigating the January 6th committee decided they didn't want to subpoena Cassidy Hutchinson, who otherwise in their written report that was an interim was assailed, because the members of Congress were sending her salacious text messages. So, I mean, this. Can you imagine that? They're all making sexual overtures to the witness. You can't get anything worse than, even in Nero's time, I think they had a little higher standards than what we've got in the Congress today. So every time they're going to subpoena somebody, okay, who sent text messages to this lady?
They don't want that to be discoverable.
Yeah, they don't want that to be discoverable. Exactly. Oh my gosh. Oh. Did Jeffrey disappear?
Yeah, Jeffrey cut off. He's hopping back on in just a moment.
Okay, great. Oh, Rizzo, I think they'd mistaken that phone for my phone, so just plug this one again.
Mhm.
That was why I couldn't get some of these messages off here.
Sorry, I guess that was my end. I guess I lost my internet connection for a bit. You were still on, Bruce?
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah. This is life imitating art, right? My gosh.
I don't, for a second, I don't know. For a minute, I lost my internet connection. I don't know why I lost the Wi-Fi, but I seem to have lost my Wi-Fi for a minute, but it seems to be back up. So, what do you know? Remember what you were saying when I got?
Yeah, I think okay, but this was Cassidy Hutchinson, where all the members of Congress who sent her sexually alluring text messages that deterred them from issuing her a subpoena. She wanted to testify. They decided to run away from it, because of their own incriminating information, not relating to January 6th, but just to the fact that there are cavemen up there who still haven't come much out of the cave. But why don't we jump?
It's not just Gates.
Yeah. Why don't we go to the birthright citizenship case? It's already one. We have a temporary restraining order issued by a federal district court in Washington, really commenting that this order was flagrantly unconstitutional, that you cannot amend Section 1 of the 14th Amendment by an executive order. And one of the things also that, to me, seems very strange even about this conversation, Jeffrey, is that executive orders are nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. It's just an invention of modern times, showing, and it's really part of the child of the limitless executive power where we move to make the presidency a monarchy de facto, if not de jure, or maybe it's de jure with Trump versus the United States. So he has an executive order. When the president gets to make the law on his own, he amends the Constitution on his own. And the federal judge out there concluded that it was an absurd assertion, issued a temporary restraining order within 24 hours. I imagine we'll get similar orders out there. But I want to comment, Jeffrey, on, because I worked at the Justice Department high levels for many years. There are certain instances in which the president, where you have sometimes laws become antiquated based upon Supreme Court interpretations of free speech and equal protection. And if an existing law is flagrantly unconstitutional, you don't necessarily enforce it and have somebody go through the pain of defending it. But in general, the standard was at the Justice Department, you have to, unless a constitutional provision can't be unconstitutional, or a statute is flagrantly unconstitutional, you go forth and enforce it. And here we have a situation where the 14th Amendment in Section 1 is very clear that if you're born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction, and subject jurisdiction means, you have to comply with the laws. If you don't, you get prosecuted. You have no immunity. You're a citizen of the United States. And at the time of the 14th Amendment, we had many who were born in the United States of Chinese coolies who weren't permanent residents, because we didn't want to build the railroad, so we brought in the Chinese coolies to build them. And that was understood and known at the time Section 1 was ratified. So the idea that we never had any illegal alien children before is absurd. There clearly was. And there can be an amendment process if you want to amend. It's arguable, I believe, Jeffrey, because Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says that Congress may implement the amendment by appropriate legislation. So when the framers of the amendment thought there may be some ambiguities that could be cured, they said Congress can take care of that through legislation. But an executive order, it's ridiculous. Remember that a president has zero role in constitutional amendments. They get proposed, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, then state legislatures consider it. If you have 3/4, then it becomes an amendment. The president has zero role. And yet President Trump is claiming I, by an executive order, can change an amendment. I can basically do a repeal. And there's got to be some restraint. Otherwise, the whole system will break down. And this is where I think Trump has taken the lack of restraint to a new level. There would be nothing. He's basically saying, Jeffrey, first, he's arguing that those who are born in the United States to parents who are here illegally are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. He said, really? You mean they can commit murder with impunity? There's no laws don't apply to them? It's an absurd proposition. Secondly, there is no limiting principle that he put on his claimed ability to decide who is not a citizen of the United States, even if you're born here. For example, there's nothing that would prevent, under his reasoning, declaring that if you're not a member of MAGA, you're not a U.S. citizen anymore, and therefore I'm going to deport you to Mars flying on an Elon Musk spaceship. I mean, I know that sounds humorous, but there's nothing in principle that he couldn't do. To strip anybody of citizenship and say, well, I'm declaring that you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, you're not a citizen anymore, we'll deport you. And so the whole system becomes completely broken. Now, it's true that you can say after the fact, later the courts can invalidate it, but lots of harm can be inflicted in the interim because courts generally, they're lead-footed, they're not mercury-footed. And what we're witnessing here is a lack of any kind of restraint. I mean, it would be embarrassing, in my judgment, for a lawyer to go to a court and argue constitutionality of this executive order. A second example, I think, that's almost as egregious is his declaration by executive order. He's going to give TikTok.
I'd like to, before you go to the second example, I'd like to just add some things to the first example, birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
First, to give a little context, the judge who made this ruling was a Reagan appointee.
Yeah.
Now I know MAGA thinks that Reagan is a rhino and a traitor and a socialist and a globalist and all other bad adjectives. So I understand that's how MAGA perceives Reagan, but I think many people might still disagree with that opinion of Reagan. And there are still a group of people out there that probably see Reagan as one of the two most conservative presidents in the 20th century, he and Coolidge. I also took a section of what the judge Kohinoor, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, said. He said, I've been on the bench for over 4 decades. I can't remember another case where the question presented was as clear as this one is. This is a blatantly unconstitutional order. where were the lawyers when this decision was being made? So we're told that this administration only hires the best. So this is that they no more DEI, pure meritocracy. The cream rises to the top. That these are the best. These are the best of the best of the best. And apparently, they're making a ridiculous argument. So they're either being intentionally disingenuous, where they know their argument is garbage, or and they're going to try it anyway because they're going to try and expand presidential power as much as they're capable of doing, or they're just idiots. So people can decide whether they are just people who know better and just completely disingenuous, or they're just dumb. So, but they're one of the two, and people can make their own judgment about that's how the best of the best of the best of the best of the best behave. So and what also makes this so absurd is that not too long ago a book was published about the fact is how did the courts become so conservative, and many people consider the author of these efforts, whether true or not, and you probably know him, Edward Meese. They give a lot of credit to Edward Meese, of populating the courts of people who embrace some form of originalism, whether it's original intent or public meaning originalism, but to move the courts to be conservative and leave that legacy beyond the presidency, to leave these courts and to train all these judges to preparation to have less supposedly activist judges, was the person that Reagan appointed Attorney General. So how absurd is it that people would denigrate Reagan appointed judges when most people consider, and maybe even a guy like Leonard Leo, who was so influential in the first, Trump administration, understand that the roots of this effort, maybe you have a different perspective because you were around. Supposedly it started with Meese. What do you think about that analysis?
Okay. It's a very good analysis, but a little bit incomplete. And here I maybe have a conflict of interest. We came in the first term. Meese was then in the White House, and William French Smith was the Attorney General. And I was the one who initiated a program where we would review candidates based upon judicial philosophy. And it wasn't whether a senator liked them or not and made a campaign contribution. And our attitude, we had about a group of 6 called the Gang of Six. We would interview and we'd ask questions like we're asking questions on a bar exam or on a Harvard Law School test, because we wanted to understand not only their philosophical convictions, but how persuasive they were in making an argument in justifying original meaning. Because we didn't want, Jeffrey, one vote. We wanted, because we understood with the bell-shaped curve, the majority of judges are kind of in the middle and wishy-washy. We wanted 5 or 6 votes. And we put somebody on who's a Scalia or a Posner or a Frank Easterbrook. We're getting 5 votes, not 1, because they know how to articulate things. And we didn't want just somebody who would be a rubber stamp. We never, ever asked them, what's your view of Roe v. Wade? We would say, how do you come to analyze the Constitution? What principles of construction would you utilize and why? And so we understood this is going to be the biggest legacy around. And we had a systematic program. They'd go through 6 of us. I don't need to remain the others of the group. And sometimes we'd get candidates that said, I've been interrogated like this since I was preparing for the bar exam. So it really began with Meese. We got assistance. We didn't get any pushback, because the way the system worked when I was there is that we would propose the candidates. There was a working group at the White House, including Meese. Jim Baker put in the political element, and then we went forward. And the audience should remember who were Reagan appointees who were epitomized what you're saying. Scalia, Robert Bork. Bork didn't quite get through, but these are the so-called epitome of the conservatives. And the one on the Supreme Court now, Neil Gorsuch, they clerked for these justices or judges. So to claim that the Reagan appointees somehow are code pink and liberals is utterly insane. In fact, the problem with the current crowd's thinking is they're setting in train this limitless power. It's going to back at some point to harm them, because when the other side gets in, they're going to use the same tactics.
Yes. So I just wanted to provide the context that I appreciate your context was obviously much better than mine. So, you were there. I just heard about it and read about it, but you were there, and for you, it's first person. So for me, it's second and third person. So it's derivative knowledge, and you have first person knowledge. So thank you very much for that. So this judge was a consequence of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can understand, and to be candid, and I don't want to sound vain here, our examination worked. We did get 5 or 6 votes for every one that we appointed who had not only philosophical convictions, but they knew how to argue it in a way that was engaging and got them involved. The Seventh Circuit turned from a very liberal circuit to what we viewed as a relatively conservative with Frank Easterbrook and Richard Posner.
I guess that maybe you would know better than that the two of them are probably one of the most cited judges on rulings. So their opinions carry weights in courts beyond their own court.
Yes, and the way in which this is shown for those who aren't in the legal system, when you cite a case, if you want to give it extra authority, you put in the parentheses, who is the judge? Easterbrook F.
Right.
Or Posner R, right? And they used to be Henry Friendly of the Second Circuit or Chief Learned Hand of the Second Circuit. So that's the way in which you're able to, demonstrate their persuasiveness and authoritativeness that comes from their brain power, nothing else, what we would call pure meritocracy, as just being one of the judges who happens to sit in a seat at a particular time. And that's certainly true. That's how if I have a case that I'm arguing and there's an Easterbrook or a Posner opinion or a Scalia opinion on it, I underscore that, put it in italics and everything else.
Thank you for that, Bruce. Okay, so I interrupted you going to the second example.
Yeah.
Okay,
Now the second one.
Birthright before we go on.
Yeah,
to the
we
next
finished.
one.
Yeah, birthright. I think it's what's going to happen here is it's going to be held unconstitutional. I do not even believe the U.S. Supreme Court will grant review. I think it'll be DOA on the circuit courts because the Supreme Court basically addressed almost the exact same issue in 1898 decision when you had someone born Chinese descent born in the United States from Chinese coolies said, no, they're not a citizen. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, they are a citizen. They're born here. That's the end of the matter. Called 1890. And that's a long time. Never been questioned since. And I don't think the Supreme Court even believes that this is worth the dignity of reviewing. But let's go to the second one. Okay, I picked this one out because it underscores, the very, very alarming principle involved in what Trump is doing. This is the TikTok decision. Now, Congress, although I disagreed with the statute, Congress passes a statute and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld it. Congress basically said, we're going to ban TikTok, but they have 270 days and they can find a buyer or they can try to have an arrangement where we're not so worried about the Chinese government knowing, if you use TikTok, they know who your favorite ice cream is and whether you got girlfriends or boyfriends or what doctors you visit or whatever. Even though I think it's a ridiculous kind of argument, it prevailed in the U.S. Supreme Court. That's the statute. Congress gave it. They contemplated extending time for for TikTok to work things out. 270 days, didn't comply. And Mr. Trump comes in and says, well, I'm going to decide 75 days, then we'll try to work something out. Why not 75 months or 75 years? Where did you get 75 days? It's not in the statute, you pluck it out of the sky. What's the ground? What's the foundation for that? And say, what's the principle involved? The principle that Trump's advanced is any law I don't want to enforce, I'll say, I'm going to try to work around it. 75, next one could be 100 days, next 3 years, next 5 years, and say, I just don't have to execute my Article 2 obligation to faithfully execute the laws. That's the end of the faithful execution of the laws. He could say that about any single law that he looked at. Well, I want to work on for 75, 90 days, 120 days, see how it works out in the interim. We'll just suspend the law. They don't have that power. What's really ironic here is that the provision in Article 2, Section 3, that says the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, it was derivative of the English Bill of Rights of 1689, where the Parliament was very exercised that King James II wasn't executing their laws. King James II was largely a crypto-Catholic, and he didn't like this is after Henry VIII had kind of abolished and the Pope. And so he wasn't enforcing the laws against those who were what so-called recusant. They would not be attending Anglican services. And Parliament says you cannot dispense and fail to execute a law unless Parliament agrees. And that provision in the English Bill of Rights was what carried over in the take care clause in Article 2 here. Now, I say, remember, I have to underscore this all the time. A constitution is not enshrined in granite. You can change it. We've got 27 amendments. If you don't like it, we have a process by which you change it. But you got to follow the rules of the game, or otherwise the process breaks down and we're back to the law of the jungle. And so here we have a president just deciding, oh, I don't want to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. I don't like the law, so the heck with it. That's the equivalent, Jeffrey, of having a repeal power. Okay, the law becomes defunct. You can't hold a gun to me and make me enforce it. And here we have a problem of how do we enforce the take care clause? Because it's hard to get how can a judge tell a prosecutor, hey, file this suit, file this complaint, call these witnesses? It really can't. And unless there either has to be good faith on behalf of the president, or you have to impeach and remove the president who's not exercising the authority that he's not only the authority, he's not discharging his obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And I'm sure the TikTok is just one example. We're going to find additional examples as where it becomes, in Mr. Trump's mind, politically opportune. But the principle is truly alarming.
No, he knows that he knows he controls the Republican Party, and he knows that while some might speak out saying, we passed this, we were serious about this, the reality is the only way they can prove that they were really serious about it, the people who were saying they're serious about it, is instead of just mouthing the words and have it being, noise, which is so far is to back up the words with action. And the way to back up the words with action is to say that they're really serious about their words, is to present articles of impeachment. I mean, other than that, they should just shut up. I mean, because it's just noise. Yeah. I mean, so if they feel strongly about the issue, they should take an action. If they don't feel strongly about an issue, then why say anything at all? So what do they want to accomplish with their words? Virtue signaling for some part. They want somebody to take them seriously. I don't know whatever reason they have, but I can't take those words as being sincere words, because if they were sincere words, they would issue articles of impeachment. And maybe if somebody issues articles of impeachment, maybe Trump would say, I'd back off and just, execute the law, because I don't want to even have this civil war in my party, where some people are saying, that they pass legislation, and they expect the president to enforce the legislation. So, and comply with it. But what they're saying is that the precedent they're establishing, this Congress, this Republican-controlled Congress, is that, whatever legislation that they pass, at the end of the day, they're going to let Trump do whatever he wants to do, and we'll have to see what the boundary is of it, what legislation that they will pass that Congress will decide saying, no, enough is enough. But, they might decide to take no action against him or anything he does, and therefore he will do anything like Congress doesn't exist.
Yeah. And I think that what underscores that, Jeffrey, is you'd feel that insofar as the members, they're going to support Trump in some way or other, at least they might have said, if you want the extension, you need to come to us. We're sympathetic. We're in your party. That's how the process works. We can amend the statute and give an extra 75, 50, 150 days. I don't even think they believe that they have any role other than being an ornament in the scene. That's not a complicated constitutional understanding. It's kind of what you learn even before you get into law school. Just if you need to change the law, you go and amend it. That's
the conversation Johnson probably should have had with Trump, is saying, look, you want to do this, we want to help you, but let's do it the right way, not the wrong way. But maybe the right way for Trump is to assert his boundless, limitless executive power. So, and he says, I don't want to set a precedent that I have to ask your permission. I want to set a precedent that says I don't need to go. I don't need your consent. I don't need your permission. I can do whatever I want. And maybe that's the conversation he had with his attorneys and saying might have said go to Congress, and he might have said, hell the hell with that. I have limitless power, and I don't need to ask anyone. So that could have been the conversation.
Yeah, it's likely if we can go back in history. I know people oftentimes are reluctant. At the time of the Korean War, Dean Acheson, he's the Harvard one. I want to underscore that the Harvard and Yale people don't have clean hands for sure. He's one of the wise men later on. But Dean Acheson's Secretary of State, and Truman says, "Well, don't I need to get a declaration of war?" And he says, "Well, no, you don't want to do that. It would set a bad precedent for Congress to get involved in the war power." Said, "Okay, I'll just do it on my own, and we'll call it a police action. A police action involving 3 million soldiers and the brink of nuclear war." So that's the mentality of the executive branch. We don't want to ever set a precedent that permits any checking whatsoever. The difference from what the framers intended, they thought Congress would react and say, wait a minute, it's not going to happen this way. You're impeached, you're removed. There's no money to do what you want to do by cutting off the funds under the appropriations clause. But we've turned into a craven Congress, to say anemic inkblot. And that's where we're headed, to ultimate absolute executive power. May not happen the next day, but I oftentimes underscore, Jeffrey, as a comparison, Adolf Hitler was sworn in as chancellor in January 30th, 1933. But it wasn't a complete dictatorship then. It took a couple years to unfold. He combined, when Hindenburg was the president and he died in 1934, then Hitler combined chancellorship with the presidency, and he said, now you have to call me Der Fuhrer. The burning of the Reichstag didn't come till a month after he was sworn in. And then he didn't enter the Rhineland until a couple years later, and then renounced the Treaty of Versailles. And so it took 3 or 4 years down the road before you had the complete police state and the SS and the Gestapo operating. So we're just in day 3 or 4 of the Trump administration, but we're racing that way very fast. Now, I know there'll be some who will, just putting it aside, this is some of the arguments that have been made about Elon Musk's hand that looked a whole lot like the Nazi salute, Sig Heil. And given his personality, it's not at all unusual that he would do that, because you read his whole life is one where he cannot operate, where he doesn't have absolute power to do wherever he wants. If he has to share power, he just leaves. He wants to rule the world by his decree alone. And the fact that you would even get close to doing something like that shows you, I think, how psychologically you're in sync with dictatorship.
Yeah, I've watched that video several times, and I'm not sure. At first, the first time I watched it, I said, he kind of went to his heart, and I thought he was trying to send his love out to everyone.
Yeah.
But then when I saw it a couple of times, I really wasn't sure whether it was like a Nazi salute or he was just emphatically trying to go from his heart and extend it to the audience. I don't really know. He hasn't really honestly addressed it. Probably because he doesn't care. But for some people who would look, if he looks at the video and could understand how some people could think that it was a Nazi salute, even if that was intention, he certainly has shown no sensitivity to the people who would be impacted by that image. So I think that says a lot about him as a human being, not anything good about him as a human being, because there are some people out there who can sit back and say, I'm not really sure what his intention were, but watching it over and over again seems to me like a Nazi salute, and to the extent that it resembled that, if that was not his intention, if it was me and I did something, that someone took the wrong way and it was not my intention, but I could see how someone reasonably would be offended by that action, I would apologize.
Mm-hmm.
So I would acknowledge saying, look, this was not my intention. I would explain myself. Maybe people would not accept my explanation, but I felt I would feel compelled to give an explanation because I could understand how my actions might have caused pain to somebody else. He just doesn't give a shit. So that's an authoritarian mentality that you do something and the consequences in the position that he has. Okay, the responsibility he has, the proximity to power he has, the fact that he doesn't think he needs to give any explanation whatsoever and has completely no sympathy, no empathy, for those people who looked at that and said were horrified that he just doesn't give a shit. That doesn't say anything very good about him as a human being, but it reinforces a lot of things that other people have already said about characterized him. So
we also know, Jeffrey, on that score again, this because I'm less concerned about it, even if it's just a salute, it's bad enough, but it's his mentality is clearly a Nazi dictatorship mentality. We have stories today that he is doggy now because he pushed Ramaswamy away, who's now running for governor of Ohio. We know what happened there. He couldn't stand have anybody even nominally, his peer. So Ramaswamy is now in Ohio, but he then approaches the judicial branch through the marshals, say, hey, you need to speed up the discharge of these these prisoners who have been pardoned. There's a process. I said, really? The executive branch breaches? No. There was ways. This is what lawyers call ex parte contacts. You just can't have ex parte contacts with with judges on anything, even going out to lunch. You make motions. You maybe talk to a clerk and say, how should I do X? But you can imagine the insensitivity of separation of powers here, which I'm sure in his mind, separation of powers is evil because it tries to constrain what he can do on his own. And and it's unfortunate that with Congress no longer being a guardrail, the courts less and less. And I hate to repeat myself, it's more and more either we're going to be the guardrail or there's not going to be any guardrail. And we know where that ends.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question about this issue, about another issue now with respect to the executive orders. The excuse he's making, Trump, regarding why he is bypassing Congress is basically the standard of what now is becoming an emergency that would trigger extraordinary executive powers. The question is how do you, from what I can see, the only way, and maybe you have a different way, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but it seems to me the only way to check a president who's misclassifying everything as a national emergency and bypassing Congress in doing so and declaring everything, it seems to me there are two remedies. One is that you pass all the executive orders that the courts say, no to. The other remedy is the Congress saying is you're usurping our power by misclassifying things intentionally because you're looking to bypass and you're looking to make Congress completely irrelevant. And so you're just labeling everything a national emergency and you're basically making us figureheads who have nothing to do. So Congress could also impeach him. So it seems to me those are the only two remedies for him classifying everything, as a national emergency that would give him this extraordinary powers to take these extraordinary actions like deploying the military in the border and, and imposing these tariffs, that they're all a function of it being a quote national emergency and economic emergency. So all the president has to say is emergency, and now you don't have Congress doing anything. Congress can say, I'm going to do this because it's an emergency. I'm doing that because it's an emergency. I'm doing this because of an emergency. And if Congress accepts the fact that the president is calling whoever that president is just by using those words emergency, then basically saying, I don't have to go and consult you for anything because it's an emergency, that's the type of precedent that I'm sure they would not like Kamala Harris, doing. And they didn't like Biden doing it, like with the student loans that Biden tried to do it, and was unsuccessful at it. But at some point, Congress is there's a theme that that you've mentioned over and over again is, at what point does Congress sit back and check presidential power, whether it's Biden's abuse, or Trump's abuse? Basically, they like to make a lot of noise. They like to chip away and cause damage to the people. But ultimately, Congress doesn't seem to want to assert its real responsibility, is that when a president is trying to expand the power of the presidency, that almost every president attempts to do, that the president keeps on doing it because they're not checked by Congress.
Yes.
So
there's one
from the Supreme Court, not Congress.
Yeah, there's an additional measure that Congress could take, and there's have a precedent that's a little less drastic than impeachment, and that's utilizing the power of the purse. We can go back to 1973, and the Congress, despite the opposition of Nixon, wanted to make sure we never got involved in Vietnam again. And they passed a statute, simply said, in sum, no monies of the United States shall be expended to conduct combat operations over Indochina after August 15th, 1973. That was the end of the war. There's no money, right? Because the appropriations power, unless you're really deranged, is definitive. The Constitution clearly gives only Congress the ability to appropriate funds to execute government functions. And so Congress could simply pass a statute that says no monies of the United States shall be expended to implement, an emergency order of the president, unless Congress approves, within 15 days, 20 days, or whatever, or simply there's not any money there. Now, Congress, in some sense, built its own jeopardy, because the National Emergencies Act of 1976 has no definition of an emergency. All it says is the president can declare national emergencies without more. My own view is that if you're really an originalist, original meaning in Article 1, which says the legislative power is entrusted to the Congress of the United States, I don't believe you can give away national emergency power. Congress can pass a statute saying we declare a national emergency, but the president on his own with no limits whatsoever. We could think of even beyond going into the hypotheticals that are extreme. The president could say that gun violence is a national emergency. Climate change is a national emergency. Illiteracy is a national emergency. It's almost any problem you could characterize as a national emergency. And who knows what Trump would say is a national emergency. He could say that Project 1619 is a national emergency. There are no limits on it. And Trump is not only gone as far as it said, I think in the State of the Union message, said two things were national emergencies: was the southern border and the energy. Meanwhile, the energy is a national emergency. We have the greatest production of energy in the history of the United States. What's the emergency about it? Why did it take presidential action?
The history of the world. We're producing more than any other country has ever produced in the history of mankind.
Yeah, and this is an emergency. And again, you're pointing out correctly, it was designed for situations where Congress really couldn't act fast enough. You're telling me Congress can't go and pass a statute saying there's an emergency, we need to do X, Y, Z? They have plenty of time to do that.
And obviously it's not an emergency because he's talking about implementing them at some future date. So given the fact that the implementation is not immediate, how could you describe it as an emergency? You take immediate action against it.
Yeah.
So if you don't need immediate action against it, how can you call it emergency if you're not taking immediate action?
Yeah. But the second thing that he did that, to my mind, is it could really lead to war, if you will, military operations in Mexico. He said by executive order that immigrants coming in illegally on the southern border constitutes an invasion in the constitutional sense, and therefore puts us at war, right? Now, remember, he says this at the same time that he characterizes the drug cartels, which wouldn't exist if we didn't supply the demand. You want to shut down the drug cartels, just shut the demand down in the United States, but we couldn't do that. He characterized it as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, that means that we can use drones to try to go kill them. We use drones to try to go kill all the other members of foreign terrorist organizations. And it goes back, Pancho Villa, he triggered John Pershing going with the army, but he didn't come with drones. We're going to end up with military conflict there, based upon that theory. And moreover, characterizing this as an invasion an invasion by people who are entering without any weapons. They're fleeing, in large measure. There are exceptions to the rule. Horrible countries that we understand are horrible, and they're fleeing in large parts because we have such economic sanctions. They're starving in their own countries. And this is a military invasion. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. It reminds me a little bit.
By people who are unarmed.
Yeah, unarmed. Yeah, the babies. You think they got arms? The women, they got nothing. This is an invasion. But and it shows
how many people crossing the border unarmed who are not acting in concert constitutes an invasion.
Yeah. It is so ludicrous. But I think we really are virtually in the Mad Hatter's Tea Party in Alice in Wonderland, where Humpty Dumpty says, now I can make a word mean whatever I want it to mean, no more or less. And that is where we are with the Trump administration. They're just making up words and saying, if I got the power, I can make black be white and white be black or anything else under the sun. I mean, at that stage,
the question is if the U.S. is being invaded, okay, if his users is being invaded, it would seem to me his constitutional responsibility is to go to Congress, declare war on whoever is invading, and put it in the responsibility of the media, of the military.
Yeah.
But instead, he's put it in the Department of Homeland Security, not in the military. And he hasn't gone to Congress, to say these are the people invading us. And they've declared war on the invasion, and I want to do a declaration of war against it. So why hasn't he prepared a declaration of war? If we're being invaded, why doesn't he identify who the invaders are, okay, and declare war against them, and then deploy the military as a consequence of a declaration of war? But instead, he wants to deploy the military under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security, to defend our borders, I guess, but to keep the invaders out, as opposed to going after the invaders. I mean, who are all unarmed, or mostly unarmed. I mean, I was watching a video the other day because I was sending it to some friends, because I was trying to make a point about something, and I watched an interview with George Carlin, and George Carlin, it was his later in life, and he said, the message I'm sending to people in my comedy right now is people suck. So, and they don't like hearing it. They're laughing. It started to resonate. Of course, they don't like hearing it, but ultimately, that's my conclusion of all my years in life. Is that people suck. So yeah, I mean, so. I watch it and I say, I kind of agree with that. How can really a reasonable person say, if I'm being invaded, what I want my president to do, if I'm being invaded, okay, is go to Homeland Security. I don't want to declare war against the invader. I don't want to go to Congress. I don't want to say this is invasion, okay? And I want to characterize people who are unarmed, many young people, children, women, okay, and who will have no arms, and these apparently are the invading force. So, because I guess, and maybe that is some evidence, the trials that occurred in Texas, the judge determined that it was not invasion, and then I've heard some people saying maybe that's appropriate, it's not the judge who defined what's an invasion is, it should be the president who determines whether the country is being invaded or not. And and if there is, I ask most Americans to say, if somebody's invading us, don't you think we should declare war? And I would say most people would probably think, yes, a declaration of war would be appropriate if we're being invaded. But apparently, we're considering unarmed people coming in an invasion, and we don't want to declare war. We don't even know who the enemy is. We don't know who really to attack, who to fight. So this is really absurd. I understand how people are frustrated. So one thing is being frustrated, at a dysfunctional political process, but at least to the extent that there's frustration, one is some people should sit and look in the mirror and say, I'm frustrated because I don't send a clear message, to the people we elect in office, and I don't expect them to live according to the constitutional foundational principles, and I'm responsible for the dysfunction of government because I've put all these people there. So we don't want to accept our own responsibility in this process. We want to just continue to blame other people when really, nothing will change until we begin blaming ourselves. So, and I don't mean to say this meanly towards people or whatever, but ultimately, unless and every one of our founders told us that the success of our republic is in our hands. It's not in the hands of the people we send there. It's in our hand. We were told that. Read almost every founder, and what did they say? What did Franklin say?
It's a republic if you can keep it. Yeah.
Okay. So it's our job to keep it. It's not Trump's job to keep it. It's not Kash Patel's job to keep it. It's not Joe Biden's job to keep it. Okay. It's every citizen, their job to keep the constitutional republic. And we're the ones who have been negligent in doing so.
Yeah. And part of that finds expression, I believe, Jeffrey, in the total decay and breakdown of the educational system. We are constitutionally illiterate. It's a pandemic that's worse than COVID. Because without constitutional literacy, you don't have any clue how the system's supposed to work. You don't understand how dysfunctional it is. If you took every participant at the Constitutional Convention and observed what's going on today, they say, well, we don't recognize our handiwork. What happened? Congress is supposed to be first among equals. The president's supposed to just enforce the law, and that's it. And the U.S. Supreme Court to make sure we have a government of laws, not of men. They say, what is it? We're back to King George III. I mean, and I give this example to show how far degenerate we've become in separation, where you can read the 27 complaints or grievances that Thomas Jefferson wrote against King George III. But really, they pale in comparison to the current presidential power, which has got no pushback from the courts or the Congress, to say, I can kill anybody in the world based on secret evidence that I think you're an imminent national security danger. I don't have to explain why. I'll never be called to court about it. I'll invoke state secrets to make sure no one knows the standards by which I conclude you're a national security danger. And it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or not, whether you're on the battlefield or not, you just get disappeared, like the disappeared in the Mikado of Gilbert and Sullivan. I mean, you can't get more limitless power than that. As we speak today, we know of a few instances because of leaks that President Obama exterminated the teenage son of Anwar al-Awlaki. He was a U.S. citizen. He was having dinner in Yemen, and suddenly the drone kills him. That's the end of it. He just disappeared from history. Most people probably don't even know that happened. But there surely are other cases of that, too, that they did a better job of covering up. But the principle that a president can kill and assassinate anybody he wants without accountability, that's the earmark of a dictatorship for sure. And it goes back to accepting this principle of dictatorship in the highest levels. Henry Kissinger, another Harvard graduate, he's the one, when we had an executive order that's now flouted every day, that inaugurated under President Ford after the Church Committee showed all the assassinations under previous president. They said, no, we're not supposed to engage in assassinations. Henry Kissinger said, this is terrible. What kind of country are we if our president can't assassinate, anybody, our opponents, That's Henry Kissinger, who at one time got a Nobel Peace Prize, showing the degradation of the Nobel Peace Prize as well as our education system. But it was the framers that said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance. It was the framers who said, if you hope to be free and ignorant in the state of civilization, you're expecting something that's never going to happen. And even in the very first State of the Union message of President Washington, he emphasized we need education, we need schooling, because public opinion puts its imprint upon government and the policies. So that's why we have George Washington University. We need institutions of learning. And right now, that's out the window. It's truly stunning how little, not only people who graduate at the highest universities, members of Congress, they don't know we have three branches of government. We got Tommy Tuberville on one side and AOC on the other. They're even passing a high school civics test, they would flunk. And that's where we're falling down on the job. because you have to understand what the Constitution means and how it ought to operate before you can understand how dysfunctional it is and can stand up and protest. If you know nothing, what are you going to protest? You don't know what to say. And that's why, if it doesn't happen in the schools, it should happen in the homes. The parents should be reading the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, explaining this to their children and saying, because if we don't understand it, if we're not the guardrails, we can't trust these people in Washington to be the guardrails, and we're going to lose it all. And what about the sacrifices at Valley Forge, the 56 who signed their death warrants on the Declaration of Independence? Are all their sufferings to go in vain because we're not willing at this stage is not to take the risks at that level that they took just because we're indolent and indifferent? Well, if we do that, we know what the end game's going to be.
It's very well said, Bruce. Very well said. And I agree with everything that you said, but very, very well said. And hopefully through our conversations, we can wake up a few people who will then maybe wake up other people, who will then maybe wake up even other people. And again, it goes back to the fact is that many people feel frustrated, but they also feel impotent. But that sense of impotence is something self-imposed. So it's not the reality. It might be their perception of reality, but if they believe that as a reality, it becomes their reality. But it becomes their reality because they've made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if they sent a different message, if everyone woke up every day with a different message saying, I'm not going to take the status quo, I'm not going to take this shit anymore, and I'm going to take action, and I'm going to be politically active, and I'm going to write letters, and I'm going to let people know this is unacceptable, and I expect the people to comply with the Constitution and the guidelines of the Constitution, that ultimately that would change the behavior of the people there, so they want they're in for self-preservation. So they want to keep their jobs. So if you tell them they're not doing their job, they'll change their behavior because ultimately they want to keep their job. So, we keep electing them saying, they're doing a good job. So of course they behave the same because that's what we're reinforcing by keep sending them back. So we still have, more than 90% of the incumbents, are still winning. So, until they think they're really contestable, their own elections, which is up to us to hold them accountable, and we're doing a lousy job at that. And this is what happens when we do a lousy job at that.
Yeah, let me offer this, Jeffrey. I've developed, it can be longer, shorter, a multiple choice constitutional quiz that every candidate for Congress should be able to pass. If any of the viewers of this program, they email me, I'll send them a copy, and they should hand this to the candidate and say, answer this question. If you get them all right, I'll vote for you. Otherwise, go back and study and take the test another time. And if you get them all right, I'll vote. So it makes them understand, there is a learning process here. It's not all that easy. We were the first country in the history of the world that actually embraced separation of powers. And it took a lot of learning to write the Federalist Papers, perhaps the greatest political science primer ever. So it isn't something you understand in a very, very short period of time. And that's why I cast these in terms of multiple choices. So maybe there's more than one answer is correct. So we actually have to think about it. But that's how the system ought to operate. If we had Congress that was healthy, Jeffrey, you can remember that every member who's a principal officer has to swear to uphold and defend the Constitution. The first thing they should be given at the committee hearings is, here's Bruce Fein's quiz. Can you answer the questions? If you can't get past that hurdle, you can send somebody else up. That's really ought to be the case.
If one was to study the letters written by the founders and letters they wrote after they were in office, this was not correspondence with the attempt of saying, "Oh, I'm going to look to get in power. I'm going to do self-aggrandizement, and I'm going to become more powerful myself," and things like that. They understood that this was correspondence going back and forth that was personal and private in nature, but this was about the consequences of their actions and them evaluating, the mistakes that they might have made, in drafting of the Constitution. So this is how seriously they took this issue. There was no private benefit, other than them really caring about producing a great country of where personal freedom would flourish. So they cared so much about that issue, that this is what they were. There's even a correspondence like between Madison and I forget with who, near the end of Madison's life, where he started really beginning to think about other forms of voting, like Condorcet type of voting, because they were concerned that what they were living through at that point in time was really not consistent with what they hoped to accomplish when they wrote the Constitution. So they got to, for a period of time out of office, get to see how the country was behaving relative to what their expectations were of what their governance would look like. And they were writing each other saying, gee, maybe I should have done this. But these are deep thought. So you get a sense of both how well read they were and how deeply they thought about these issues.
Yeah.
So
and remember Thomas.
Can you imagine 4 years from now, a correspondence between Trump and Obama, on governance? Okay, deeply thoughts on it, saying, let's have a philosophical constitutional discussion on governance, that would be comparable to the writings of Madison and Jefferson, on these topics. Okay.
Yeah. Listen, we know, for example, Jeffrey, Jefferson thought his greatest accomplishment was the University of Virginia, learning. That was what was needed to carry forth the legacy set in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. And you're absolutely right. They were writing for the ages, and they wrote for themselves. They said, listen, we have to make this succeed, because if we fail, self-government will be discredited for centuries. So we have to they didn't say we need to make this succeed so I can get rich, so I have Bitcoins, and then I can aggrandize my family and stuff like that. It was truly the greatest generation was the framing. It wasn't this one. They had blemishes. There was slavery in some of the states, not all. Women couldn't vote or whatever. But in terms of setting the standard, the aspirations, nothing even comes close to the founding generation. And when you talk about, the letters back and forth between Madison and Jefferson, it was clear that they recognized, and Madison at the very end, which caused him great anxiety, that he was the last of the founding generation when he died in 1836. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, was still around. But he could see with Andrew Jackson, who celebrated suspending habeas corpus and imposing military rule,
right,
and the Trail of Tears, exterminating Native American Indians, that he could see it was worrisome, the kind of leadership that had replaced the founding generation. And that was, and I call that the beginning of the end, because you'll notice in Trump's inaugural, he raised again the specter, in his sense, a laudatory specter of manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny was an idea that was born right after Madison died, which was based on the idea that we were God's new chosen people, that we should go all over the continent first to impose our view of the world on everybody else by force and violence. And the only people who knew what was manifest was us, nobody else. Manifest us that we need to conquer Mexico, then we need to conquer Oregon and elsewhere. I mean, it intellectually brainless idea, and led very quickly to the Mexican-American War, based on a flagrant lie, almost like the second invented torpedo attack in 1964 on a Mexican soldier had killed a U.S. soldier on U.S. soil, which was a lie. Abraham Lincoln introduced a spot resolution telling President Polk, well, we're on spot on U.S. soil. Did the U.S. soldier die? And of course, Polk didn't have an answer, so he just refused to answer the question, ran away from it. But Mr. Trump brings up this idea of manifest destiny, which is, I say, it's the handiwork of people with no brains, but a whole lot of bigotry and just wanting power for the sake of power, and says, well, that's what we're going to do. Manifest destiny in Panama Canal, in Greenland, in Canada. Where else are we going to get manifest destiny? The South China Sea. He's tried to rename the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America. Then he's got to rename, I'm sure, the South China Sea, the Sea of America.
He did rename it already. He did rename it. Executive order renamed it. So, but and really the intention. I mean, if you take a look at like Jefferson's the analog of Jefferson doing the Louisiana Purchase, that was a defensive move, because the
And we had
Europeans
treaties.
was,
Yeah.
the Europeans were still in the continent. You know, as we know, we had the War of 1812 some years later. So you know, we purchased in 1803, and then we had the war in 1812. So we still had people who still wanted to undo the American experiment, and so he did that to protect America. You know, at that point in time, which was very vulnerable nation at that point in time, and people.
Yeah, it's you
And
truly got
the Lewis and Clark, one of the things, the Lewis and Clark was also something about science. This was about the pursuit of knowledge. This was not about aggrandizing American power, but the pursuit of knowledge was.
But the Louisiana Purchase speaks volumes about what we're talking about, Jeffrey, because there was done as a negotiation between nations, right? France. It was by a treaty. We need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify. Take it. We go up to the Mexican-American War. It was preceded by the effort of James K. Polk, the president, to get Texas annexed by a treaty. The Senate voted down, couldn't get 2/3. Says, okay, I'll just do this by a statute where I only need simple majority. So he evaded the precedent of the Louisiana Purchase because he couldn't get the Senate. Because the Senate said, no, we end up with Texas, we're going to have a civil war. And they were very prophetic on that score. But here we have the president evading a constitutional, institutional bedrock of Senate 2/3 majority in order to arrange and ratify a deal with another nation. At that time, Texas was a nation. So the manifest destiny itself was a signal. We're not really serious about the Constitution anymore. We're just going to do what we need to do in order to rule the world as we see it ought to be, like, you know, the new chosen people. And Jefferson precedent on Louisiana Purchase is just thrown out the window. We don't need to do a treaty anymore. We tried it and we couldn't get it. And it continues today. I apologize, but these, I think, particular cases are important to understand. This is not just academics and, you know, to get you a pass, an A+ in a classroom. As recently as Obama's, you know, so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it's negotiating with foreign countries to try to restrain Iran's nuclear ambitions. And when the Secretary of State, John Kerry, was asked, how come this is not a treaty? These are a deal with foreign countries. His answer was, well, we never could get it passed in the treaty, so we just had to do it on our own. You know? I mean, really? Well, we couldn't get the bill passed, so we just did an executive order.
But that was perverted also by the Republicans, because the Republicans cut a deal saying, well, you know, if you get enough objections, it doesn't pass. So they ended up having some congressional vote, but that was a simulation. That was not the Republicans checking.
I think what
they
happened,
said, okay, we don't want to give you a treaty, but we're not going to block you from the outcome. So let's simulate something, okay? And so they did a simulated transaction, okay? So making both of them look horrible. The executive branch and the legislative branch.
Yeah, the details ended up this way, so that Congress said, okay, you can do an illegal executive order, but if we pass a statute, a majority of the House and the Senate, which you can veto, which we would have to override with a 2/3 vote, because he's not going to sign a bill that overdoes his executive order, then it'll be a null and void. And of course, they do exactly what Obama, they knew the game plan. Congress knew whatever it did.
Simulation. That's why I said it was a simulation.
No effect whatsoever. Yeah.
That's why I say it was a simulation.
Yeah. A simulated protest. They didn't really mean it, because they knew they would need 2/3 to override. So now we have the situation where instead of the president,
more just noise.
Yeah. I mean, this is truly turning the Constitution on its head. Now it's that rather than requiring 2/3 of Congress to ratify a treaty, now you need 2/3 of Congress to override a treaty negotiated by the president, you know?
Exactly. Absurd. So, Bruce, in wrapping this up, what would you like to be your concluding words for this fine points?
Well, I think that it's very important for everyone on this program. I hope it's not dwindled, you know, to take seriously what Jeffrey and I have said. We all have to pitch in. One of us can't do it on ourselves, and be very alert and always be asking about what Trump is doing. Process. Even if you agree with the outcome, process is critical. And ask, why isn't the process adequate here? Why did Trump not go ask Congress for an extra 75 days to try to do something with BitChute? And I think Jeffrey got it right. He's trying to
Big
set a
time.
precedent so that there are no guardrails anymore. Then I really can rule as though this was a wholly owned subsidiary of Trump Enterprises, and I don't need to ask anybody. Well, that maybe works in business. It's not what the framers fought for in 1776. And again, I would encourage you, try to call town hall meetings, keep asking, Constitution, where is it? It's in written document. Point to the clause. I don't take it on face value anymore. Mr. Trump one time thought Constitution had 12 main articles. It doesn't. It has 7. So to that extent, if we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately for sure, even if we're a small number.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce. Always a
Okay.
wonderful conversation with you.
All righty.
Have a great
Thanks.
day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.